good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending on your time zone, of course, and depending on whether you're watching the recordings or you're watching this live. It's again time for the happy hour, and we, of course, hope that you spend this happy hour with us. It's beautiful weather here in the Netherlands, so not on the terrace at another happy hour, but here with us. Because we have a wonderful topic that we're going to discuss today, and that is the potential or the advantages or the disadvantages of a lottery as a means for funding allocation. Therefore, we have three wonderful speakers today with us: some proponents, some opponents for lottery in funding allocation. So and we do this today is slightly different. Normally we have one speaker and we have 30 minutes of discussions, but now we have three speakers. And we really have put them, asked them to be to use maximum 10 minutes. They prepared a presentation. So after 30 minutes, we will start the discussion. We will first start the discussion then with some statements that the panelists will discuss, and then the floor is open for you, for the audience, to participate in the discussion. This works via the chat. We have a chat function, so please, if you have a question or specifically to one specific person or in general, post it in the chat, and we will hopefully have time to discuss your question or concern or remark in more detail during live sessions, or if not, hopefully we can respond to it in a later stage. So having said this, let's start directly with our first speaker. We have three speakers, as I said. We have Serge Horbach, we have Matthias Egger, and we have Marcel Levi. I will introduce them briefly before they speak, but we first start with Serge Horbach. He is an assistant professor of ethics, controversies, communication, and innovation of the biosciences and technologies at the Institute of Science in Society at the Rijksuniversiteit at Nijmegen University. He has a degree in mathematics and obtains his PhD in Science and Technology Studies, STS, for work on scholarly publishing, peer review, and research integrity. And after some different works abroad, he rejoined Radboud University in March 2024 in Nijmegen, and he continues his work on scholarly communication, research integrity, public trust, etc. And he's also known for his great papers on innovative interventions for funders, how they can improve their practices like partial lottery or open applications. So Serge, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jori. Yeah, so let me share my screen. I hope this works.
Yes.
I see nodding, great. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. I'll do a bit of the same and introduce this session to you, talking about, or describing what it is we're talking about when discussing lotteries in grant funding. What does that mean? What different options do we have? And what are some of the associated potentials, benefits, or downsides and risks? So when we talk about funding, allocation, and the use of lotteries or partial randomization for that, there's quite a host of options. Of course, we have the one with no lottery at all. That's called out today the traditional way of allocating funding, which involves maybe peer review practices or some other quantitative, maybe indicator-based way of ranking, assessing applicants and their proposals. But then there's also among that been a lot of variation, but for us today, that is everything that contains no formal lottery. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the systems of pure lottery, where just every applicant enters the lottery, all have equal chance of being drawn. and we allocate funding just based on chance, on a random process. And then in between that, and I guess most of the discussions we're having today will be about that middle category, are various systems of partial and or weighted lottery. So that means only part of all applications enter into the lottery. That can be in a very minimal sense when it's only used as a tiebreaker. So you do the normal process of peer review or whatever system, and only for the very final, very tricky cases, maybe 2, 3, 4, very difficult to assess or rank proposals, you use lottery just by more or less flipping a coin and deciding which of the proposals gets the last bit of funding. And there's systems where you only do the lottery on fundable proposals, or say only the good ones. So you use traditional ways to weed out all the lesser quality proposals. You end up with all proposals that you would initially want to fund, or in some ideal situations, if you would have the resources, you would like to fund all of these proposals. Usually you don't have those resources, so a decision has to be made, and you use lottery for that. You can have that same system, but then with a bypass, which means that you don't only get rid of all the poorer quality proposals through peer review or the like, but you also take out of the lottery the very best proposals. So this top segment where the jury or the committee agrees that those should definitely be funded, you take those out, you fund those, and you only use the lottery for like the middle segment, the ones that are good enough to be funded, but don't rank among the extremely excellent ones. And then you can add weights to those if you want some lots to have more chance of being drawn. So some proposals that you think should be in the lottery, but maybe should have a slightly higher chance of being drawn than others, you can modify the lottery using weights. So that all in all gives quite a host of different options. And many of these in different ways are being used in funders across the globe with different backgrounds. We have public, national funding agencies, like the one in Austria, Switzerland. We'll hear more about that later. The Norwegian Research Council, they all, for some of their, or even all of their programs, have some kind of lottery involved. There's private funders like the Volkswagen Foundation or Novo Nordisk doing this. There's disciplinary councils, like the one or some in the UK or Canada, New Zealand, that are doing this. And then just more locally, for instance, in the Netherlands, some universities like in Tilburg and Utrecht for smaller grants, usually seed funding and the like, also use some of the funding or lottery-based systems that we saw on the first slide. And these do that for all kinds of reasons. There's many different reasons why the different funding agencies have engaged in this in these kinds of processes. Most of them primarily try to tackle the known deficiencies of peer review-based decision-making. And there's some element of chance already involved in that. We often say that one can get lucky with the reviewer or with the review process. But that kind of chance is usually not equally distributed. It's the usual suspects that then get higher chances of being funded than others. And while many of these funding or lottery-based systems are fairly recent, Some evaluation has been done, and across the board, one of the findings that keeps returning is that lottery-based systems do very well in terms of increasing diversity among funded projects. That is both in terms of characteristics of the applicants. Women tend to be funded more in those kinds of systems, other minority groups, but also more epistemic factors. So disciplinary differences or niche topics, which see an increasing diversity under lottery-based systems. So that
3 more minutes.
I'm perfect on timing then. Thanks, Jori. So that addresses items like Matthew effects, biases, etc., inherent in peer review-based systems. There's potential efficiency gains. Of course, that depends a lot on the kind of lottery system that you're using and the extent to which you still use traditional methods to weed out some of the proposals. Potential mental health benefits, doing justice to the effort spent by applicants, and there's potential benefits in terms of applicants, if they don't or no longer need to be at the very, very, very top to be funded, but can be in this group of all good and fundable projects, then that could make people less inclined to engage in practices like overpromising or other corner-cutting behaviors, which might be beneficial to research integrity. We've described some of these potential benefits a while ago, together with Lex Bouter and Jori in this paper. And apart from those benefits, there's of course also all kinds of associated risks with these kinds of systems. The main here is an argument that keeps returning, and for good reasons, is this idea of epistemic justice. While lottery might address some kinds of fairness or bias issues, the idea that only the best projects should be funded and that lottery might be a risk associated to that is an argument that we keep see return in the discussions about these systems. Concerns about potential decrease in public trust in science have been voiced before. And overall, there's this argument that, well, we know very little about how this all works, what kind of side effects these systems have. Does that change behavior among applicants? Does it change the quality of the proposals or the actual work then being done? Again, initial evaluations seem to suggest the contrary, where there's no difference in kind of output of these projects and the like, but that is still initial, so much more to be discussed there. And I'll leave it at that for my introduction.
Yeah, thank you so much, Serge, for this nice overview. We directly go to the second speaker of today, which is Professor Matthias Egger. He's a professor of epidemiology and public health at the University of Bern in Switzerland, as well as professor of clinical epidemiology at the University of Bristol in the UK. He completed his clinical training at the University of Bern and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And he was from 2017 to until November 2024, was president of the Research Council of the Swiss National Science Foundation. He's also known for describing the method for detecting biases in review by analyzing funnel plots. And he is here to talk today about their experiences in Switzerland with partial lottery. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Juri. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about the experience that we had at the Swiss National Science Foundation. So the Swiss Science Foundation is really the national science funder in Switzerland. And on this slide, you see some statistics. So we fund about every year about 3,000 grants in different schemes. So projects, careers, programs, infrastructure, and science communication. We have a budget of about 1.1 billion Swiss francs and more than 80 evaluation panels. The spirit of the Swiss National Science Foundation is very much by science for science. So I've been a member of the division biomedicine since 2017. And one thing that I observed during these years when I just was a simple member of the Research Council was when it came to actually decided who gets funded, particularly in the sort of middle ground, the fundable proposals that were not outstanding, but definitely good enough to receive funding. There was a certain, and I think this slide sort of illustrates that, a certain competition. Who gets his proposal through to funding? And all sorts of arguments were put forward during these very memorable meetings, the so-called Ausscheidungssitzung in German. And I always felt very uncomfortable about these processes and the criteria that people invented in order to get their proposal across the line. So for the reasons that Serge also very nicely summarized, we basically looked into this in great detail. And one thing that few people had realized is that there is an element of chance in funding. And these are the studies, and the sort of landmark study which created this field was the Cole study in 1981. All these studies essentially did look into reliability or reproducibility of decisions. So the same proposals were sent to two panels, and in one study the panels were actually divided into two at random. So that was the best study, that's the Fogelholm study in Finland. And what they found was that the agreement between the two panels was around 70%. So there's clearly an element of chance in funding decisions at the level of the panels. There's also something else which is interesting. Depending on who you are, you tend to be more generous or more critical. And this is empirical data from the SNSF, which shows, for example, that in the social sciences, in this call, assessor 8 was much less generous than assessor 14. So there is something about, people being more generous or less generous. And that is, of course, is an issue when from proposal to proposal, the composition of the panel changes. Some people have conflicts of interest. Some people have to collect their children from creche. Some people are not well and are not participating. So the composition of the panel and chance is something that we wanted to look into and to find a solution to. And we described this method, which is a Bayesian ranking method, in this paper. And I can briefly illustrate it. Again, this is empirical data from a call. And you see, for example, for the humanities, the expected ranks show that proposal 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all below or on the funding line. And there's a clear difference between the light blue ones, which are the worst proposal and worst ranked proposals. There's a clear cut, and it's clear we're going to fund the first 4. So these 4 proposals here. Whereas in medicine, you see 4 proposals sitting on the funding line. We only have so much money, and we cannot fund all 4. So in this situation, we basically randomly select the 2 we can still fund for medicine. So among the purple ones, we randomly select 2 because we can't fund all of them, and don't discuss them further, don't have this situation that I showed on the slide. So Serge already discussed a little bit taxonomy. I will be very brief here, just to say that our scheme is a partial, non-weighted, with cutoff top and bottom. So essentially, it's only the middle group of applications that enter the random selection, the partial lottery, if you like. And you see on this table that different funding agencies have used different implementations, and there's quite some variation in how different funders have implemented partial lottery or full lottery. Actually, not a single funder has had the courage to implement full lottery for obvious reasons. So depending on what you think about peer review, you will choose a different type of lottery approach. And in yellow, you see what we believe at the Swiss National Science Foundation. We think that peer review can detect more or less reliably high quality and low quality research. The problem is really that middle group. And we therefore opted for partial lotteries that exclude the top and bottom proposals because they're either directly funded or directly rejected.
2.5 minutes left.
Yeah, here are a few statistics. You see that relatively few proposals go into lottery, and I would concentrate. I would concentrate on the. Let me see. Can I show that on the column with 17 on the top, which is the proposals entering random selection among all projects discussed at the panel meetings. And you see that overall it's only 8%. There's some variation across funding schemes, and this panel is or this table is taken from this evaluation which we recently conducted of our way of evaluating proposals by Culture Base and some other organizations which you can download and look at. So my open questions, this is my last slide. Does partial lottery funding really reduce bias, increase transparency, fairness, and diversity? What's the evidence? And how solid is it? Does it reduce conservatism? To what extent is there a reputational risk to a funder? These are taxpayers' money, and you have to be very careful. Does partial lottery reduce the quality of peer review because people think it doesn't matter? It's anyway a lottery. Does partial lottery reduce trust in the selection process by applicants, peer reviewers, panel members, politicians, the public at large? What proportion should go into the partial lottery to maximize benefit? I personally think that at the SNSF, not enough proposals go into lottery to really see the benefit. So with this, I'm closing, and I'm just showing you a slide with some literature, including Serge's great paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was a very nice overview of the empirical work that you have done in the Swiss National Science Foundation. We directly go to the third speaker of today. I'm very happy that he's here. His name is Professor Marcel Levi, born in Amsterdam in 1964. His education is first he became a doctor, then became a medical specialist in internal medicine and a professor in medicine. And in 2010, he became the dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Amsterdam. Then, in 2017, he was till 2021, he was the CEO of the University College London Hospitals and professor and clinical dean at the University College in London. He has, and since then he became the chair of the national funding agency, the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research here in the Netherlands, one of the most important science funding bodies in the Netherlands. And he has definitely no fear to speak up. And we are all grateful that he's here with us to discuss his position on lottery from his personal perspective, but also from the perspective of NWO. Marcel, the floor is yours. And you're muted, and sometimes it becomes a little dark around your face. So you need an extra light. I would love to put an extra light on your face.
Okay, I'll see what I can do. In the meantime, I'll just start in the interest of time. Sorry about that. Thanks, Yuri, for the introduction. Thanks, people from the network, for inviting me. And of course, thanks to the previous speakers, Serge and Matthias, for introducing the subject. I'm going to be a little bit, to give you a few reconsiderations if we talk about lottery, and I'm going to be slightly robust, but this is only for the sake of the argument, because to be totally honest, personally, and also at the Dutch Research Council, we have not completely made up our mind on whether we're going to do a lottery or not. Having said that, we already do lottery for years because we have an ex equo policy. And if we really don't know if the scores are really equal, and you can debate on where the boundaries are, then we do lottery, although we are replacing that, or we try to replace that with diversity policies. So we can also use the ex equo policy to promote, for example, women in science in disciplines where they are not really represented. So I'll give you a few considerations, only 5, so bear with me. I hope this is going to work. Always difficult. Yes, I think we are scientists. We're not people doing religious things. So it's not about what we believe, but it is about what science tells us. And the first question I'd like to pose is that people very easily say, well, there is a top group and there is a bottom group, and the problem is in the middle group, and there is an area of gray, and we cannot decide. At NWO, we had very nice experience recently, where at the end of a complete procedure, we found out that there was a conflict of interest of the chairman of the committee, and we had to decide to do the entire procedure all over again. So we could actually compare two completely similar procedures with different committees, with different reviewers, with different everything, because we did it all over. And we found out that there are gray spots in the area of judgment, but they're also at the top and they're also at the bottom, and they're not necessarily in the middle. Sometimes it's really easy to actually say who is above the line and who is below the line. So I think it is we all assume that the difficulty is in the middle, but that is not always the case. And that's something we need to keep in mind. We also have some similar experience in other grand rounds that show exactly the same. And then, of course, it is interesting to see what the neighbors do. And this has already been introduced by Serge and Matthias. I have in particular looked at funding organizations that look like the Dutch Research Council, and they have also been shown in previous slides. And there is an interesting thing, if you look at what these people do, including the Swiss National Science Foundation, and that it is mostly very small grants we're talking about, less than 100,000 euros. High risk, high gain projects that are very hard actually to judge anyhow, because they're very variable and very difficult to see what their real value is. It is actually mostly done after peer review and committee judgments. And interestingly, most of these experiences have been published, but the outcomes, what are we actually looking for? Is this indeed more fair than the traditional way of judgment? Or is it less work? Or is it more economic? Or other positive things that are already been mentioned by previous speakers have actually never been proven. And that's the difficult thing, because we are actually quite keen to do an experiment, lottery and no lottery, in the next few years. But we are actually looking very hard, and this may be nice for the discussion, to look at the outcome. What are we actually looking for? How do we know that one is better than the other? Well, very often said that it is less work for the funding agency, if you find that important. But actually, if you're going to use partial lottery, and that's what most people do, only to distinguish, only to help you in the middle group and not in the top and in the bottom group, you still have to do peer review and you still need a committee. And it is very likely not less work for the funding agency than it is now. Another interesting outcome could actually be satisfaction amongst the people who actually are part of the process. And it's very often said that people are a little bit more satisfied when they are not selected because of lottery than if they are not selected because of a committee judgment. But is that actually true? Is there any evidence supporting that? Well, let's look at, and there's not a lot to find in the literature, but let's look at the experience in New Zealand, where they actually looked at this. And I'm only going to very briefly show you what they did. They asked people after a lottery or a traditional selection whether they thought it was acceptable. They didn't ask whether it was preferable, it was acceptable. Most people thought that for the small grants they were dealing with, this is 50,000 euros, so really small grants, it was acceptable. But similarly, if you ask the same question for other grants that are bigger or more important, there was actually no majority of people who thought this was acceptable. I'm not even talking about preferable. And even more interestingly, if you then ask these people who were actually part of the process whether they were satisfied with the result, then those who were not funded by lottery actually had a similar percentage of satisfaction than those who were declined by panel. And if you would actually ask the same question for other grants, bigger grants, more important grants, then there was no one, it's very small numbers of course, who was satisfied by not funded by lottery, and still 25% if they would be declined by panel. So this is something we need to keep in mind. We need more research before we can say that people are like to be not selected by lottery rather than declined by the panel. And it's also interesting to look at other areas in society where it is sometimes difficult to come to a decision. And people usually get very angry with me if I compare science with sports, but I still do it now and then. And there are many sports actually where there is just a committee and a judgment, and they don't even dream of having a lottery to decide who is the best skater, turner, or horse rider. And also, for example, in the legal system, it's sometimes very difficult to come to a judgment. Is this person guilty or not? Still, we actually place trust in judges who come to that decision. And there is no lottery to decide whether you have to go to jail or whether you should not go to jail. And I can come up with many, many other examples where actually difficult decisions are still being made on semi-objective, semi-subjective grounds. And we actually do not think or do not even dream about lottery. And then, of course, all speakers before asked, well, what would the people where the money come from think of all this? And that's the taxpayers and the politicians. And there is a little bit of evidence what they think about this. And this comes from the UK, where actually in Parliament, there was almost a riot when a lottery of tax money, which was an idea similar as what we discussed now from UKRI, was discussed. And it was actually rejected by the largest majority that you can think of. And also the newspapers actually had a field day in actually depicting a lottery, or they called it a raffle for research, as being a very negative development and something that should never happen, at least not in the UK. And then lastly, I have one other consideration nobody talks about. But if we make it a lottery, if we make our grant system a lottery or even a partial lottery, we have to pay tax. There is tax lottery in almost every European country. And you have to pay 30% tax if you are a winner in a lottery. And I'm not completely sure that people who are actually granted a research grant would be very happy if they had to pay 30% tax because they got the grant because as a result of lottery. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'll stop sharing and I hope we will have a nice discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Marcel, for this very nice 5 reconsiderations regarding the previous regarding the topic, and also already in response to the previous speakers. What we're going to do now, I'm going to share 2 statements, and I would love to hear, and then the discussion will unfold, hopefully, because I already saw both Matthias and Serge really wanted to respond to your potential reconsiderations by already moving a little bit difficult in their chairs. So I would give enough room for them to respond. I will share my screen right now. This is the first statement. And can anyone see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So partial lottery is more acceptable to applicants than traditional approach to allocate research grants. Maybe I would like to give Serge the floor first. Do you want to respond to this statement?
Yeah, sure. Fine. So, well, I completely see what Marcel said in his talk, that, well, we'll have to see how does that work out in practice. I noticed one of the questions in the chat asking, would you mention in your CV a prestigious grant application that was judged to be fundable but was unlucky in the lottery? Would you mention that as an applicant? Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I just moved back to Nijmegen last year, and then when you come back, you get this list of criteria for if at some point you want to make a promotion. And on that, they actually mentioned already. Traditionally, probably that was something like how much money did you bring in through funding application, but now it's actually already added there, or how many applications were deemed to be excellent or fundable. So maybe my university is very progressive in this, but they've already included that in their internal promotion criteria. So to answer that question in the chat, yes, probably. And that might then also relate to this statement. I guess, at least for some people, that might help. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Serge. Matthias, you want to respond?
Yeah, I first would like to respond to a few points that Marcel raised.
Yeah.
The first one was the middle ground. And I completely agree with you, Marcel. There's not always a middle ground. And the graph that I showed actually showed several examples where there was a clear, distinction between the good proposals and the less good proposal. So at the SNSF, we use this as an option. If we have this situation with the middle ground, which is difficult, and where we know the discussions can, get difficult and very long, and biases can creep in. In that situation, the panel can decide, let's use partial lottery. And of course, every member of the panel votes on a scale from 1 to 9, and then the Bayesian ranking is being produced. So it is a very transparent, I think, a process. But you're absolutely right. It's not always necessary. Now, regarding satisfaction, I think it's very interesting in Switzerland to see that the younger people, more junior people are really very happy with the introduction of the partial random selection. They strongly feel that it is fairer. They always, mention examples where they lost out to someone who is more, let's say, present or older, famous, etc. The tax point, I just wanted to mention, this is partial lottery. So there is still an evaluation going on. It's really only dealing with that situation when we have this middle group of basically equally good proposals, but we can't fund all of them. So we don't pay tax in Switzerland, and it's never been raised. By the way, the politicians in Switzerland have not commented on it. There's no pushback from the public at large so far, and it's now been going on for a while. And then more research is needed. I completely agree. We will, of course, collect these data because essentially at the SNSF, we now have a randomized trial of people who were funded and people who were not. And we also want to look at impact funding has on people's careers, on output, etc. So that's certainly something we will be looking at. And again, if you are thinking at the NWO, whether you want to introduce this, I think the evaluation report that I showed, which you can download, might be useful. So partial lottery is more acceptable to applicants than the traditional approach to allocate research grants. I really think it depends whom you ask. In general, applicants are more in favor, and young applicants particularly, than older members of the panels or the research council. Interestingly, the Swiss are more conservative in that respect. There's more pushback from the Swiss than from the international members and peer reviewers. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you. And it would be very interesting to also measure then the satisfaction of the applicants in the Swiss system. That would be wonderful as a future research objective.
But you see, the letter that the applicants get says, you submitted a good, fundable proposal. That's the message they get. And then you were either lucky or unlucky, because we couldn't fund all. And that is a message people prefer to a letter which lists a lot of weaknesses of your proposal.
Yeah, but Marcel's point is also that more research is needed on that. I would like to give the word to Marcel, and then we go to the next statements.
Yeah, I'll be brief because we covered most ground. I think the answer to the question is we don't know. I think that's the shortest, but also the most. We don't know. It has never been systematically assessed. The ERC actually looked at this as well and decided not to introduce lottery, but they did something interesting, and that fits to what Matthias was just saying. You get a letter from ERC and they say you submitted a fundable proposal. We were happy with your proposal, but in the end, in the competitive stage, it just was not fundable for us. And you can actually use it. They actually give benefits if you have a judgment like that. You can actually resubmit in the next year or so, and you can put that on your CV as well. There is also a last thing I want to say about satisfaction. You can also use that middle ground, those 4 grants that are really very close to each other, to introduce your diversity policy. And to say, well, in technical sciences and in some natural sciences, we want to have more women and we want to stimulate them. So if we have these almost equal judgments for 4 grants, why don't we give a preference to submissions that come from female proposals? You can even do weighted lottery if you think about this. So those are alternatives you can also think of.
Thank you so much. Is the next statement also visible now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. So the next statement is using partial lottery to allocate public research funds will lead to severe criticism in the media and the parliament. Marcel already alluded to this in his 5th reconsideration. And then I saw Serge heavily moving. So Serge, you want to respond to this?
Sure, I will. Yes. So I think indeed that was a good example Marcel brought forward. I think indeed also there's different experiences in different countries with this. So in Switzerland, as indeed Matthias mentioned, I don't think we have seen such a response. It was specifically looked at in the German situation when the Volkswagen Stiftung did that. Surely there's a bit of a different situation because they're a private funder, but still. But then I thought also maybe in relation to this, Marcel's comment on other areas in society where we don't use chance or randomization to make difficult decisions. I think I think it relates somewhat to this statement. And I also think the crucial difference here, for instance, between sports matches and funding applications here, is that funding applications are somewhat of an a priori assessment, or you assess or what might happen in the future if you fund something, rather than something that has already been performed or been done. So I think maybe a closer resemblance can be found in an area where we actually do use randomization in another part of society, is when we allocate positions for certain studies, like medicine or so on, where we have too many applications for students who want to do a certain study. And then there have been different ways of dealing with that, and lotteries or randomization have been one of them. We moved away from that and did this decentralized selection based on tests and motivation letters and so on. And then one of the implications of that was that many of the students, well, diversity of the students decreased, let's say like that. And many of them were female, daughters of parents highly educated, etc. And we moved back, at least partially, to this randomization. So I think it's not unheard of to make difficult decisions in this way, especially when there's some evidence of at least some benefits of that. And it seems to be acceptable to the media and the public.
Yeah. Marcel, you want to respond?
Yeah, very briefly. I think we need to discriminate that there is politicians who are in favor or against it to there was just no discussion so far in Parliament. I think most people are not even aware on how we distribute grants, but if it would become a topic, they would certainly have an opinion. And that may be the cause that in Germany and maybe in Switzerland, I don't know the exact situation, it has not been discussed in Parliament because they just didn't know that it happened. I'm pretty sure, but that's a belief, that's not science. I'm pretty sure that if this would come up in Dutch Parliament, we would have a complete riot. And I can think of 2 or 3 politicians who would make a very, very big case of this, that we are just going raffle away the tax money that all these poor people in the Netherlands have to pay. So I'm a little bit depressed if I think about that. Serge is actually right in saying 2 things. One, it is sometimes it's prospective or it's retrospective. And the numerous fixes, of course, we know. But if there is one topic that there is an endless debate about, then it's actually numerous fixes. And it was not for, it was actually for a very good reason that we moved away from lotteries. And then we went to decentral selection. And now we are going to reverse way, or at least partly, because also the politicians don't know what is better and have the same struggle as we are having.
Yeah. I'm sometimes I'm just unlucky that I'm the chair, so I cannot respond. But Serge, you wanted to respond or not?
Well, I'll happily give Matthias the chance.
Yeah, Matthias.
I can just expand a little bit on the statement, Marcel, that you made that lottery is not used in society. That, in my view, is clearly incorrect. Yesterday, we had the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Now, who went to the Vietnam War? The military draft in the US at that time was a random process. So there were conscription lotteries. Some governments also use lotteries to assign jobs, for example, in North Korea. Healthcare, organ transplantation, when medical urgency and matching are equal, random selection is often used, and so forth. So random selection is an established policy instrument that many societies use to increase fairness in certain situations. In sport, of course, you often have a very clear measure. So how many goals did Ajax Amsterdam score? Or how
Not a lot.
In the last two matches, it was very troublesome.
Who is running the 100 meters the fastest? You know, there are very clear criteria, and in the situations where they're not clear criteria, like for example in ice skating, and you have these judges and they give scores, I personally think there may well be scope for random selection. But anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe just as a brief add-on to that, I think indeed Marcel's right. In the current situation, political climate in the Netherlands, I think it's somewhat likely that at least some politicians would take this as a very offensive move. One of the arguments that one could think of countering that is that, of course, we're not, if we're doing this kind of lotteries, giving out the money to just anyone. We're here only distributing funding to people that are in academic positions that have been deemed qualified on the job in many other evaluations and selection processes. So distributing funding among those, I think, is somewhat different from just randomly handing out taxpayer money to whatever.
Yeah. I do want to thank you, Serge, and also thank you, Marcel and Matthias, for these very wise considerations that you have put forward. I would like to go to some more topics. The first is relatively simple. That's just a yes or no, Marcel, from a certain Lex Bouter. He says, you said that we need more research. Would NWO be willing to fund research and to perform that research in NWO funding program that would focus on the most important issue that we need evidence on?
Yeah, nice question. Yes, we do. We have put aside not a lot of money, but quite enough money to actually to study this. So we are, and this is research on research, but we think that lottery might be a very interesting topic there. And we have just asked Arnold Lubbers, who is our expert here in this area, to think with colleagues about what kind of trial we would need. Ideally, we would do something like a randomized controlled trial. And I think, and we can do that, but probably one of the most important things is what is going to be the outcome, the primary outcome of the trial.
Yeah.
But well, we will think about it, and we will certainly be willing to do that and to share the results with all people.
Yeah. Or maybe even ask for advice on it from experts already, like Matthias. That could be helpful. Another interesting question that comes from Frank van Let. Because given the fact that there's only 10 to 15% grant, the chances of getting funded. So what about lottery at the top end? How do you judge the 93% score compared to the 96% score? So would that be fair to allocate the research funding only to the 96 score instead of the 93 score, or would lottery then be an option?
Is it
anyone?
Yeah.
If anyone would like to respond? No one would like to respond. That's interesting. So can we? I reformulate.
I thought the question went to Marcel. Can you repeat it? I can.
No, it's how can we distinguish? What about lottery at the top end? So the score of a 93 compared to a 96. Is that the gray area? And should you then only fund the 96% score and not the 93% score, or should you apply a lottery to this?
Well, I think this is part of either this tiebreaker or partial lottery or randomization, where indeed in some funding schemes you now need scores like 96 or 97% or so to make it to the cutoff and to be funded. which then indeed would leave the 93 to 94.5% in this gray zone. Yes, and I think especially in situations like that, where you would then actually have a gray zone, using some kind of lottery would be acceptable.
I'm not completely sure I understand the question, but I would like to respond to the term tiebreaker that has now been used a couple of times. I only know tiebreaks from tennis, and it's actually not a lottery. If it's 6-6 in tennis, we just play another game to see who is going to be the winner. And that's something we could also consider. If there is really a tiebreaker, we could actually ask the two competing or the three competing applicants to do something extra, to submit a video or an implementation plan or whatever we can choose, and actually see whether that helps us to decide who is going to be the one who gets the grant and who does not get the grant. It's quite labor intensive, but it is an alternative.
It will create a lot of additional work, Marcel.
Yeah. Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
And one feedback that consistently comes is, oh, I'm so happy about this random selection. We're going home earlier.
Yeah. The researchers do.
But back to your question, I think you need to calculate the uncertainty around the rank in order to be able to judge where, what to do in this situation. It's not just 97 or 93. You need to understand how, chance played into this. And that's what that's what we do with these Bayesian methods. You saw these confidence intervals, these vertical bars on the slide that I showed.
Yeah. And this is also, if you read the Q&A from Michael Williams, for example, he made a really interesting point that we cannot discuss, but I will leave it here for discussion, because as Serge pointed out, funding competition already include a large element of chance, luck with the panel, etc., luck with the reviewer. So most sports also include a lot of luck, but many partly formalize it through, for example, a toss of a coin or choose ends or the order of play. So his question is, isn't a partial lottery in the same, just formalizing part of this element of chance, but only make it more a different type of chance? I think this is a very interesting thought, and also a good food for thought in if we discuss lottery. And we only have 2 minutes left. I would love to have another extra hour to discuss with you, and don't go to the terraces yet with this beautiful weather. But we unfortunately have to end this discussion. And we don't end this discussion. This is just another extra layer of discussion. I think all three speakers are very open for the idea of further discussing this, but also trying to find more research on, trying to create more research on it, that we have more evidence whether we want to do this or not. And I think this is also a further step for all three speakers. Having said this, I would really, really thank you all three for preparing for this happy hour. We are very grateful that the three of you took the time and the opportunity to present your ideas and work and have a very vivid and vibrant discussion. I would also love to thank the audience. One final remark: we have another happy hour coming up. I'm going to share it with you in the screen right now. Also a beautiful, this is for next month, the 18th of June. Put it in your agenda. It's how to start, scale, and sustain culture and behavior change. And Professor Brian Notzek from the Center of Open Science will talk about this in more detail. We're really looking forward to this as well. Thank you so much for today. And I hope we continue these discussions, and we try to answer the questions in the Q&A in more detail after this webinar. Have a wonderful evening or morning or night for wherever you're watching, and until next month.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.